After many years in the hobby, I've painted a mountain of miniatures, often swept away by the inspiration of the moment. This meant that I've never owned a fully playable army. Until now. When I first stepped into the mortal realms of Age of Sigmar, it was the allure of the Nighthaunt that captivated me. From the haunting lore and ethereal look to the sheer visual presence of their miniatures, I was hooked from the start. Picking up units from starter sets like the original Start Collecting and the epic Soul Wars box set. So the time has finally come to unite these spectral warriors under one banner. Join me as I dedicate myself into building a full and formidable Nighthaunt army. In a series of videos released throughout the weeks, I'll not only be painting each unit, but also sharing with you each trick, tip, technique, and even the thought process behind every brushstroke. If you're ready to delve into the chilling beauty of the Nighthaunt and witness this army take shape, then let's not waste any time and get started with this amazing project. And so, to begin the building of my Nighthaunt army, I couldn't think of a better centerpiece than the sorrowful and majestic Lady Olynder, Mortarch of Grief. This miniature has always held a particular fascination for me. Her visual presence alone perfectly encapsulates her despair and the chilling nature of the Nighthaunt. But it's not just her striking appearance. Lady Olynder's backstory as Mortarch of Grief truly elevates her. Imagine a being whose mere presence can drain the hope from the hearts of even the most valiant warriors, crushing their spirits before harvesting their souls to bolster her spectral ranks. It's a narrative richness that I can't wait to bring to life on this model. With a quick prime and a smooth layer of white, the Mortarch of Grief was ready to receive her spectral tones. By the way, if you're curious about the foundation on which Lady Olynder and the rest of my army will stand on, make sure to check out my latest video on how to create amazing and evocative bases for your miniatures. Being an already intricate miniature, I decided to paint Lady Olynder and the two Banshees separately, and then to glue them together in the end. The very first element to capture my attention on Lady Olynder has always been her ethereal veil, that sorrowful shroud that seems to whisper tales of despair. To achieve that seamless ghostly transition across such a broad surface, I knew that wet blending would be the perfect technique. To do so, I quickly mixed some periscopes with ghostly green in an around 80 to 20% mix and added some glaze medium to give me more time to work with the paint. I started by applying this mix to all the bottom part of the veil, creating a solid surface. After the first layer, I created a 60 to 40% mix of periscopes and ghostly green, and started wet blending it with the previous layer, where I wanted to create that ethereal gradient. By adding more and more green, my goal was to create a gradual lightning effect moving upwards, culminating in an almost pure ghostly green around the bust. To achieve this, the process was simple but crucial. I continued to wet blend, incrementally adding more ghostly green to the mix with each pass. This gradual shift in the ratio ensured a smooth and natural-looking transition from the deeper, shadowed tones to the brighter, more ethereal greens on the top. To further enhance the sense of depth and richness in the lower folds of the veil, I introduced a glaze of dark Prussian blue. Applying this layer added subtle shadows and a touch of a cool undertone, enriching the color and making the ghostly green pop even more, helping to define the recesses and create a more three-dimensional feel for the fabric. The next step was to bring this transition to an almost pure white over her head and the top parts of the miniature, where I wanted to drag all the attention. To do so, I kept adding to the ghostly green progressively more and more ivory. In this case, I use ivory because of its high content of white. I'm not scared to desaturate the color a bit, in fact I prefer it, since the veil is still a ghostly relic, and that desaturated pale look will help me sell that effect. But at the same time, using this color for the intermediate layers helps me avoiding the chalky effect that pure white tend to have. To really make the skull beneath the veil stand out, I then proceeded highlighting its form. I added a touch of pure white to my previous ivory ghostly green mix and applied a general highlight to all the raised areas of the skull. Finally, for those sharpest edges, the rims of the eye sockets, the jawline, and other prominent features, I used a pure white highlight to create crisp, eye-catching details. When it came to painting the two accompanying Banshees, I used the exact same palette I used to paint Lady Olynder. However, I deliberately stopped the highlighting process earlier, right after adding a small amount of ivory to the ghostly green. This decision was made to ensure that the visual focus remains on the Mortarch of Grief herself. By keeping the highlights of the surrounding elements less intense, Lady Olynder's brighter and more defined details will naturally draw the viewer attention. Having used a nice bluish gradient when thinking about a color for her hair, my thought immediately went to an orange tone. Those colors work amazingly together, not only because their complementary nature creates vibrant contrast, but also because I want to use them to tell her story. A woman of striking beauty who dedicated her life to deceit and betrayal to the point of getting noticed by Nagash. The vibrant orange of her hair represents that facade, while her true sorrowful nature remains concealed beneath the veil from which you can see it shine through. To avoid the cartoonish, overly bright orange, I began by mixing grunge brown with hot orange, creating a more grounded base tone. To further desaturate the color and make it feel slightly less alive, I then introduced some German tank crew brown into the mix. Achieving full coverage over the primer required a couple of thin coats. Once that was done, I moved on to the highlights, adding heavy golden brown and more hot orange to the initial mixture. The heavy golden brown has a lot of yellow in it, and adding it with more orange to the initial mix will help me create a more natural and realistic color for her hair. For the two accompanying Banshees, I intentionally took a different approach, to ensure they remained visually subordinate to Lady Olynder. I painted their hair using a more pale and desaturated tone, avoiding adding the orange in the beginning, and using only the browns to make them feel more lifeless. All this work of keeping the Banshees a step behind is going to really make a spotlight shine on the Mortarch in the end. To finish them off and still match Lady Olynder's theme, I washed them with the same orange and reapplied the final highlight by simply rebrushing the paler brown I had used before. Having passed a bit of a hell trying to reach all those spots through those intricate details, I decided to paint the last of them, the roses that adores Lady Olynder's figure, before trying to paint her crown and her staff. For the verdant leaves and stems, I used a dark green base coat and then proceeded highlighting it by adding more green sky to it. I chose this green because of its more desaturated tone, allowing it to blend seamlessly with the spectral theme of the miniature without drawing too much attention or resulting too vibrant. For the roses, I used a light violet and a pink as base tones. Being very light tones, I then proceeded by applying a layer of express colors to make them a bit more vibrant pretty quickly without having to apply too many layers. Once the express paints were dry, I just reapplied the two base tones only on the most raised edges, creating subtle highlights and adding a touch of definition to the petals. Now, for her imposing crown and terrifying stuff, I decided to go with non-metallic metal, and more specifically with copper NM. But why copper? Well, those rich orange colors are going to work beautifully alongside her hair and contrast nicely with the greens of her veil. My starting point for the non-metallic metal was a deep dark base coat of dark rust. This establishes the darkest shadows immediately, giving us the essential depth for a metallic look. Next, I started building up the midtones by mixing in Hollow Red. This introduces that characteristic reddish warmth you see in aged copper. I applied this over about 70% of the areas, leaving the dark rust showing in the deepest recesses. For the highlights, simulating where light would catch the metal, I began progressively adding elf flesh to the mix. With each layer, I covered the smaller area, focusing towards the sharpest edges and points where light would reflect most intensely. Now, adding elf flesh does tone down the redness a bit, making it look like more pale brass in this stage. But don't worry, that's intentional. In the next step, we are going to bring that coppery warmth back. I took some hot orange and thinned it down to a glaze consistency, then applied it to all the copper areas I just painted. This glaze tints everything, enriching the midtones and unifying the blends, really selling that copper effect. Finally, for those super sharp final glints of light, I used a tiny touch of pure elf flesh right on the extreme edges and reflection points. To finish off the stuff, there's that creepy rock embedded in it. Simple job here, started with black, then built up highlights by mixing increasing amounts of ivory, focusing on the upper surfaces and edges to make it look like worn stone. For Lady Olynder's skin, I wanted something distinctly unnatural, so I opted for a pale cold violet. I started with heavy violet as base tone, then, just like for the highlights on her veil, I began mixing in ivory. I applied probably 3 thin layers of highlights, adding more ivory each time. The goal was to push these highlights to a very pale, almost white violet on the most raised points, like her knuckles, giving the impression of cold, lifeless flesh. The original deep violet remains only in the deepest shadow areas, enhancing that chillingly beautiful, yet undeniably dead look. With Lady Olynder herself basically completed, it was now time to turn my full attention back to her spectral attendants, the Banshees. First thing first, their skin. I used the same pale violet color and the highlighting techniques that I used for the Mortarch of Grief herself, keeping things consistent. Then, it was time for those terrifying screaming skulls. For the base, I used the heavy golden brown. I then highlighted the bone by mixing in ivory, focusing on the brows, teeth, and the raised cheekbones. To add a bit more depth and subtly tie them with the Banshee's color scheme, I proceeded giving them a thin glaze of heavy violet only in the most recessed areas. This just adds that little touch of sinister connection. Finally, finishing off the Banshees meant painting their relics. One carries an hourglass, while the other a cursed chest. For the hourglass frame, I used the simple silver and technique, starting dark, building up grey midtones, and finishing with white edge highlights. For the glass itself, I painted it blue, then highlighted it by adding ghostly green towards the top or center, simulating light shining through. The chest was pretty straightforward, a flat brown base coat for the wood, highlighted by mixing in some pale sand for a weathered look. For the little gold ornaments, a simple layer of heavy golden brown gives them that tarnished gold appearance without needing full non-metallic metal. Alright, almost everything is now in place, the last thing to do is to finish off the base. I start with a mix of black, Dawnstone Grey and periscopes all over the rock's surface. The periscopes will help me give to the grey a slightly blue tint that will work amazingly with the overall tones of the miniature. To highlight it, I start by adding ghostly green to this mix and to dry brush it on the most raised surfaces. To finish off the rocks of the base, I start by adding more ghostly green to the mix and painting smaller and smaller areas closer to Lady Olynder with each layer. Trying to paint it, placing the highlights on the elements that are facing the miniature, creating a sort of OSL. The last detail to paint were the leaves and stems that I painted exactly like I did before, but this time stopping the highlights one step before. The base could now be completed, but to further bring it to life, I decided to add some grass tufts, and to better tie them into the overall environment, I decided to give them a quick dry brush using the same color I used for the final highlights on the rocks. And after a quick layer of black over the rim of the base, this was the final result. Even though I had a really hard time painting all those intricate details, I'm very happy of the final result. And I hope you'll love to see me painting this miniature as well. I'm really happy I was finally able to paint this miniature, and also not only just to paint it, but trying to recreate and tell her story, to express her feelings and background through my colors. And I have to admit that I'm pretty happy of the color choices I made and how they work together. This miniature also signs the beginning of an epic project, so if you want to follow me in this journey, make sure to subscribe. And if you liked the video, consider to leave it a like. Don't also forget to let me know down in the comments if you're creating your own army and what you're painting. And until next time, don't forget to keep moving forward into this big mini's world.